Welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponder. I'm your host, Neil Trotter, and today we're going to continue our series on this channel that I have called something along the lines of why is this channel called the Black Ponder and not just the Ponder, or why we got to insert the race thing into the whole situation of this channel. It's a frequently asked question, and I've made many videos about answering this question. We got a whole playlist, and I'm going to continue answering that question because I think it's quite important. And we're going to do that via a discussion of this. I would consider a modern classic. Let's get close up so we get a nice view of this. Yes, it's called The New Jim Crow. And listen to the subtitle. Mass incarceration in the age of, okay, let's say this together, color blindness. Color blindness. Okay, that's this key word today. Color blindness. So there's this idea, this notion, right, that we as a society are past race. Like that's something, that concept is something that we no longer have to pay attention to. And there are many people, successful individuals of color who have gained great success, and there's no excuse anymore. We've done great things in our society that have contributed to civil rights and social equality, and we're done with the whole racism language or talking about race. We've moved past that. This is the year 2021. What are you talking about? There's also this notion that this is a philosophy channel and therefore you shouldn't be talking about race. Race is irrelevant when we talk about philosophy. There's also the idea of, well, philosophy can help you transcend beyond the idea of race, as if one can philosophize themselves out of race or like the construct that is race. Like that's something that's possible, but it's not. It's not possible, and some people will say, well, I don't see race. When I look at you, I don't see a black person. I just see a person that likes to read philosophical books. Why are you calling yourself that? You're making me think about that. I am colorblind, essentially. Well, I would argue that you're not, and you're in denial. And we're going to talk about why that's the case with this book, which is, a very popular book that's been around for many years now. This is actually the 10th anniversary of the book. And we're going to begin reading the preface that was written by the author, Michelle Alexander, celebrating the 10th anniversary of this book. And she talks about how, yes, this all that I've talked about 10 years ago is still quite relevant to today. And by the way, the 10th anniversary of this book was written in 2020. That's a year ago, so 11 years old to this day. So let me begin by letting the book do the talking. We read quotes from the book, from the text here at the Black Ponder. In case you're new, you might be new to the channel. We read quotes directly from the book. I feel that's very important. And then we add supplementary commentary via my talking points, as well as the comment section down below is a discussion. So in case you have this book and you would like to follow along, we're on Roman numeral XXII 22, page 22. And this is the third to the last line of that page. The official bipartisan consensus was that black incarceration rates were skyrocketing because black people had stunningly high rates of drug addiction and violent crime. This was not only a highly distorted telling of the story, it seemed to be the only version of the story that mainstream audiences were willing to hear. So I start with that quote because what the book is about is mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow. Jim Crow, which was a horrible system of laws with the purpose of racial segregation, separate but equal, but not really equal. These set of laws were used to greatly disadvantage and disfranchise and exploit African Americans, black people in America. It was a social economics control system that negatively impacted black people. Now, what Michelle Alexander is saying here is, look, our mass incarceration system, the criminal justice system here in America, it is the new Jim Crow. And this is not hyperbole. She's like, no, actually, you can see strong equivalencies between Jim Crow, the system of Jim Crow, and today's criminal justice system. We shall continue. I'll just continue where I left off. In my experience, whenever activists, especially black activists, challenge discriminatory or abusive policing or question state and federal budgets that shifted billions of dollars away from education, public housing, welfare, or drug treatment to brand new high-tech prisons, someone would inevitably interrupt the conversation to raise the subject of violent crime, especially black-on-black crime. This discursive maneuver was often performed casually in an offhand manner, yet it proved to be a stunningly effective way of refocusing attention on a relatively small number of individuals who cause harm, thus shielding from critique an entire system that inflicts incalculable harm on millions. And that's what we're talking about here. The Black Ponder, what this channel is about using philosophy to help, solve the problems of today, the serious problems of today, right? Social injustice, huge problem today. And a lot of that is race-based. Now, oftentimes you get people trying to avoid that topic altogether. I don't want to talk about social justice. That's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about dialectic materialism. That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a priori. That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Plato's theory of forms. That's what I want to talk about. We talk about all of that on this channel. But we also got to get down to, okay, what are the problems that the world is facing today? And how can we use philosophy to solve those issues? And I think philosophy is an underutilized tool that has tremendous promise and capability and utility to address a lot of these problems. But in the philosophy realm, in the school of philosophy, a lot of people who are into philosophy, they don't want to go that way. They just want to stick with their abstract theories and their abstract ideas and not apply them to real world problems. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying to bring it about. And I feel like the deflection of when people ask me, why do you call yourself the Black Ponder? That's like a deflection. That's a deflection. I'm trying to redirect. I'm saying, like, look, this is a problem. This is one of the problems that's facing the human race. This is the human race, right? Is the issue of race itself. And we need to talk about it, and we need to use philosophy to address this issue. It's going to help us out a lot. But now I will continue. We are on the last paragraph of page 23 of the preface. The prevailing view that mass incarceration has been driven by arrests and convictions for violent crime is simply wrong. It is a lie that has been invoked to excuse and rationalize the intentional infliction of suffering on millions of people. The truth is that the overwhelming majority of people sentenced to prisons and jails, as well as those placed on probation or parole, have been convicted of nonviolent crimes, especially drug offenses. So we have this misconception of how criminal justice actually works. The popular opinion is criminal justice is, it works to keep us safe from very violent people. But the vast majority of people that are targeted by the criminal justice system are not violent people. They're nonviolent people. People who do nonviolent offenses. And not only that, they're a certain kind of person, nonviolent offender. What kind? Well, not the white kind. But we'll continue. We are now on page 25 of the preface. This is the last paragraph of that page. Many politicians, law enforcement officials, journalists, and some academics continue to create the false impression that most people sent to prison or jails or labeled criminals or felons have been convicted of violent crimes. They point to the current composition of state prisons as proof of this imagined fact, ignoring that sentencing practices distort our understanding of who is sent to prison and why. The lie that most people sent to prison are violent offenders is dangerous because it perpetrates the false notion that our system of mass incarceration is primarily concerned with violence and that it is well designed to keep communities safe. In fact, our system is primarily concerned with the perpetual control and marginalization of the dispossessed. It is not designed to respond meaningfully to the harms of violence. Okay, so what is philosophy about? It's about getting at truth, is it not? Is that not what philosophy is about? Getting toward truth. We have a false misconception of our criminal justice system, and it's destroying us as a human species. It really is. We could be going so much further as a society, as a species, if we understand the truth of our criminal justice system. But we choose to ignore it, right? The vast majority of us choose to ignore how it actually operates. It's time to confront this issue. Now, on page 26, this is the last paragraph, starting at the second line. Few people seem to understand that the system of mass incarceration extends far beyond prison walls, shaming, stigmatizing, and controlling people whether or not they've actually spent time behind bars. In this way, the system functions much more like a caste system than a system of crime prevention or control. Okay? Criminal justice as a caste system, not as a way to carry out justice. But let me skip over. We're on page 27 of the preface. And this is the second paragraph, fourth line. A system that brands people often at very young ages as criminals and then ushers them into a parallel social universe in which they may be denied the right to vote and be subject to legal discrimination in employment, housing, and basic public benefits for the rest of their lives. Let's think about that for a second. Denying people the right to vote, to discriminate them from employment, from housing, from basic public necessities. Two questions come to mind. First, is that really an effective method of distributing justice? Because some people will say, well, they're criminals, they deserve that. Well, does that really work in practice? Like, are you eliminating the problem of criminality by taking away people's rights, first of all? Second of all, are you even effectively applying that to the people that are violent offenders or are perpetrating crimes that actually hurt people? Right? I mean, that's two things. Like, we got it all twisted. But if we understand how the system, the objective, the true objective of the system, then we can understand, okay, now we know how this actually functions, and we can address the truth of the matter. Now I am on page 29. This is the second paragraph, third line. We're still at the preface though. We will never close prisons on a large scale in this country or drastically reduce the prison population if we do not change the way we view and respond to violent crime. As many advocates have pointed out, the distinction between survivors and perpetrators of violence is largely illusory, as virtually no one commits violence without first surviving it. Reflexively locking people in cages and subjecting them to degradation and humiliation, inflicting violence and suffering upon people in order to teach them that violence is wrong, is a doomed strategy, especially considering that most people who commit violent crimes are victims as well. If we want to reduce violence in our communities, we need to hold people accountable in ways that aim to repair and prevent harm, rather than simply inflicting more harm and trauma and calling it justice, right? And we talked about this in another video, Why Prisons Are Obsolete by Angela Davis, but here Michelle Alexander brings it up too. Like the prison system, like putting people in essentially torture chambers, you think even if they violated some law, is that an effective way to solve the problem of crime. Like, will those people learn their lesson? Like, it doesn't work like that. And we know this, right? But we choose to just turn a blind eye and be like, well, they deserve it, without really thinking about what's going on or who we're actually applying these punishments to, and do they actually correlate with the goals that we present, like the prevention of violence. Now we're on page 31 of the preface, and this is the second paragraph, sixth line. We must come to see the system of mass incarceration as a form of organized violence against our communities, rather than a meaningful response to violence committed by individuals within our communities. The safest communities are not the ones with the most police. Just basic common observance will show you that. The safest communities are not the ones with the most police, prisons, or electronic monitors, but the ones with quality schools, health care, housing, plentiful jobs, and strong social networks that allow families not merely to survive, but to thrive. What our community needs and deserves is no mystery. The more difficult question is, what is necessary to end the politics of white supremacy? That's where I said it. Well, not only did I say white supremacy, I said politics, two no-no words when a lot of people talk about philosophy and they're like, don't talk to me about that kind of stuff, but we're talking about it. To reimagine, I'm continuing, justice and to rebirth democracy in America. Now, we're on page 32. This is the second paragraph. We must do what is required of all liberation struggles. Educate ourselves and others. Speak unpopular truths. Provide support for those who have been harmed and organize against the systems that seek to oppress, control, and divide us. We must demand reparations for current and past wrongs, open our hearts and minds to one another, and heal our communities as best we can. We must act with great courage, as well as compassion and humility, for none of us has all the answers. Ultimately, our goal must be to reimagine what justice can and should mean in our communities and our nation as a whole. A task that requires the participation and leadership of those who have suffered most. There is no roadmap, no guidebook. We must make do with lessons of history and carry forward the struggles of earlier generations, guided by a moral compass that honors the dignity and value of us all. That's what we need to do. And we can't do that by ignoring race. Right? We can't do that. I know it's an unpopular truth. One would say, like, well, race is just a constructed fiction. Yeah, but it creates real results, real truthful results that we can't just ignore because they're happening. So I'm going to read this next quote. This is page 2. We're out of the preface. We're into the introduction. And we're going to talk about this whole idea of color blindness and why I should not call myself the Black Ponder because we don't see race. That's the thing that actually happens. No, it actually doesn't. But we're going to keep reading. This is the second paragraph of page 2. What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Obviously, I get that question. Just don't even use that word, black. Just don't use it. Okay, we're just going to ignore the problem, huh? It's just not going to be a thing that we're going to try and solve. No, we're not doing that. Sorry. Rather, I'm continuing, that rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals. Okay, we don't use words black. Instead, we use criminal. Okay, two sides of the same coin, but we will continue. And then engage in all practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you are afforded scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. And that's what she's talking about, Michelle Alexander, when she's saying the new Jim Crow. We've just redesigned the system. Okay, it's still here, it's just in a different form. But now we're on page 5. This is the second paragraph. People who have been incarcerated rarely have difficulty identifying the parallels between these systems of social control. Once they are released, they are often denied the right to vote, excluded from juries, and relegated to a racially segregated and subordinated existence. Through a web of laws, regulations, and informal rules, all of which are powerfully reinforced by social stigma, they are confined to the margins of mainstream society and denied access to the mainstream economy. They are legally denied the ability to obtain employment, housing, and public benefits. Much as African Americans were once forced into a segregated, second-class citizenship in the Jim Crow era. And so the common response to this would be, well, you perpetrated a crime. You have to be punished. You don't deserve the right to vote if you violated the law. Right? I mean, this is the punishment that we've distributed to you so you can learn your lesson, or that other people won't do the same thing as you. Right? You might think like that, but we got to understand, right? What is the objective of this system? Right? Is it really trying to stop crime, or is it a system of social economic control? What's going on here? Like, what is it? Is this really a distribution of punishment for the sake of stopping crime? Is that the objective of mass incarceration, criminal justice? I will continue reading. This is page 8. This is the third paragraph. These stark racial disparities, the disparities within the criminal justice system, which are well reported, and you can look it up easily. Check out the several databases that are out there of criminal justice, or you can just get this book and look at all the work cited here and all the references. Right? She gives you plenty. The author gives you plenty of resources to back up what she's talking about. And there definitely is huge, significant racial disparities within the application of criminal justice here in America, the United States. But let me continue reading. These stark racial disparities cannot be explained by rates of drug crimes. And she brings up drug crimes because the author brings up the war on drugs, right, which was a huge kicking off point for the mass development of prisons here in the United States. Studies show that people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. Okay? If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in drug crime than people of color. That is not what one would guess, however, when entering our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown people convicted of drug crimes. I'll skip down to the second to last line. The lack of correlation between crime and punishment is nothing new. Sociologists have frequently observed that governments use punishment primarily as a tool of social control, and thus the extent or severity of punishment is often unrelated to actual crime patterns. Now I'm on page 9. This is the last paragraph. The stark and sobering reality is that for reasons largely unrelated to actual crime trends, the American penal system has emerged as a system of social control unparalleled in world history. And while the size of the system alone might suggest that it would touch the lives of most Americans, the primary targets of its control can be defined largely by race. So what's the objective of this book? What's the thesis? I'm about to read it to you. Okay, we're on page 14. Settle down, strap yourself in, because this is a log read, but this is very important. Mass incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow, and that all those who care about social justice should fully commit themselves to dismantling this new racial caste system. Mass incarceration is the most damaging manifestation of the backlash against the civil rights movement. The popular narrative that emphasizes the deaths of slavery and Jim Crow and celebrates the nation's triumph over race, quote unquote, with the election of Barack Obama is dangerously misguided. Okay? Oh, well, a black person was president of the United States. We defeated racism. The colorblind public consensus that prevails in America today, i.e. the widespread belief that race no longer matters, has blinded us to the realities of race in our society and facilitated the emergence of a new caste system. We skip down 4 lines. Like an optical illusion, one in which the embedded image is impossible to see until its outline is identified, the new caste system lurks invisibly within the maze of rationalizations we have developed for persistent racial inequality. It is possible, quite easy in fact, never to see the embedded reality. Truth. But I'll continue. Page 15, second paragraph. The aim of this book is not to venture into the long-running, vigorous debate in the scholarly literature regarding what does and does not constitute a caste system. I have a video about that if you want to check it out. Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Goes really deep into that. But that's not what this book is about. This book is about, well, I'll continue reading the quote. I use the term racial caste in this book the way it is used in common parlance to denote a stigmatized racial group locked into an inferior position by law and custom. Jim Crow and slavery were caste systems. So is our current system of mass incarceration. It may be helpful in attempting to understand the basic nature of the new caste system to think of the criminal justice system, the entire collection of institutions and practices that comprise it, not as an independent system, but rather as a gateway into a much larger system of racially stigmatized and permanent marginalization. This larger system, referred to here as mass incarceration, is a system that locks people not only behind actual bars, in actual prisons, but also behind virtual bars and virtual walls. Walls that are invisible to the naked eye but function nearly as effectively as Jim Crow laws once did at locking people of color into a permanent second-class citizenship. The term mass incarceration refers not only to the criminal justice system, but also to the larger web of laws, rules, policies, and customs that control those labeled criminals both in and out of prison. Once released from prison, people enter a hidden underworld of legalized discrimination and permanent social exclusion. They are members of America's new undercaste. You know, you might have a family member. Almost everybody knows somebody who's classified as a felon, and many of us, because of that relationship, understand the discrimination that that person has to deal with on a daily basis. It's not so much that a lot of us don't know, it's that a lot of us choose to ignore, right? Or we don't want to confront the issue. I'm going to continue though. I skipped down 2 lines. We avoid talking about caste in our society because we are ashamed of our racial history. We also avoid talking about race. Don't call yourself the Black Ponderer, call yourself the Ponderer. No. We're not going to avoid the problem. We even avoid talking about class. Conversations about class are resisted in part because there is a tendency to imagine that one's class reflects upon one's character. What is key to America's understanding of class is the persistent belief, despite all evidence to the contrary, that anyone with the proper discipline drive can move from a lower class to a higher class. We recognize that mobility may be difficult, but the key to our collective self-image is the assumption that mobility is always possible, so failure to move up reflects on one's character. By extension, the failure of a race or ethnic group to move up reflects very poorly on the group as a whole. What is completely missed in the rare public debates today about the plight of African Americans is that a huge percentage of them are not free to move up at all. It is not just that they lack opportunity, attend poor schools, or are plagued by poverty. They are barred by law from doing so. And the majority institutions with which they come into contact are designed to prevent their mobility. To put the matter starkly, the current system of control permanently locks a huge percentage of the African American out of the mainstream society and economy. The system operates through our criminal justice institutions, but it functions more like a caste system than a system of crime control. Viewed from this perspective, the so-called underclass is better understood as the undercaste, a lower caste of individuals who are permanently barred by law and custom from mainstream society. Although this new system of racialized social control purports to be colorblind, it creates and maintains racial hierarchy much as earlier systems of control did. Like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. But we're just going to keep going. We're not going to stop. Let me continue. This argument may be particularly hard to swallow given the election of Barack Obama. Just mentioned that. Many will wonder how a nation that just elected its first black president could possibly have a racial caste system. It's a fair question. But there is no inconsistency whatsoever between the election of Barack Obama to the highest office in the land and the existence of a racial caste system in the era of color blindness. The current system of control depends on black exceptionalism. It is not disproved or undermined by it. Others may wonder how a racial caste system could exist when most Americans of all colors oppose race discrimination and endorse colorblindness. Yet, as we shall see in the pages that follow, we'll discuss, it's going to be a long video. Racial caste systems do not require racial hostility or overt bigotry to thrive. They need only racial indifference. I repeat that. They need only racial indifference. Don't call yourself the Black Ponderer. Call yourself the Ponderer. I'm indifferent to race. That's all. Hello, you just supported racial inequality by doing that. As Martin Luther King Jr. warded 45 years ago, he said the same thing. Dr. King, he sure did. This is the top of page 19. A new social consensus must be forged about race and the role of race in defining the basic structure of our society if we hope to ever abolish the new Jim Crow. This new consensus must begin with dialogue. That's what we're doing now. A conversation that fosters a critical consciousness, a key prerequisite to the effective social action. This book is an attempt to ensure that the conversation does not end with nervous laughter. No, I don't. No, we're not going to talk about this. next time, no, we're going to talk about it. And we're going to use critical consciousness. Also, philosophy, okay? I'm going to skip down to the last paragraph, page 19. What this book is intended to do, the only thing that is intended to do, is to stimulate a much-needed conversation about the role of the criminal justice system in creating and perpetuating racial hierarchy in the United States. The fate of millions of people, indeed the future of the black community itself, black community, Black Ponderer, hello, may depend on the willingness of those who care about racial justice to re-examine their basic assumptions about the role of the criminal justice system in our society. The fact that more than half of the young black men in many large American societies are currently under the control of the criminal justice system or saddled with criminal records is not, as many argue, just a symptom of poverty or poor choices, but rather evidence of a new racial caste system at work. But I need to continue because we need to focus on the truth of the matter. This is page 23. We begin at the top. If the movement that emerges to challenge mass incarceration fails to confront squarely the critical role of race in the basic structure of our society, okay, if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites, who are often pitted against poor people of color. We're not leaving out other groups too. We're just saying what the problem is And we're saying that everybody's getting messed up because of it. The collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. Inevitably, a new system of racialized social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee. Just as the current system of mass incarceration was not predicted by anyone 30 years ago. No task is more urgent for racial justice advocates today than ensuring that America's racial caste system is its last. We got to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it's just going to be repeating itself over and over again. There's this notion that, oh, because you're talking about it, you are basically embodying the problem, right? But that's not how solutions work, right? Solutions don't happen by ignoring problems, right? That's not how you solve problems, by ignoring problems, right? You solve problems by confronting problems and talking about problems and, figuring out how to solve problems. Talking about an issue is not perpetuating the issue, okay? Not talking about the issue is perpetuating the issue. But let's discuss this notion of black exceptionalism, this idea like, Barack Obama, black guy, president of the United States, we've solved the race problem. We know Dr. King's dream has been realized. Let's talk about that for a little bit. Okay, this is page 26. Okay, this is the third paragraph. The fact that some African Americans have experienced great success in recent years does not mean that something akin to a racial caste system no longer exists. No caste system in the United States has ever governed all black people. There have always been free blacks and black success stories even during slavery and Jim Crow. The superlative nature of individual black achievement today in formerly white domains is a good indicator that the old Jim Crow is dead, but it does not necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have simply taken a different form. What was being said is that, look, there's always been exceptions to the rule, right? I mean, that's part of how it succeeds. But we do have to acknowledge that, okay, these exceptions show like, okay, this is not Jim Crow, this is not slavery, this is not Jim Crow, this is something different. It's still devastating, huge numbers of people within society, but it is different. And what Michelle Alexander is saying is, look, racial caste is a thing that has always existed in America, and it shifts forms, it changes. So although this is not specifically Jim Crow, there is a racial caste system happening. But let me continue. Any candid observer of American racial history must acknowledge that racism is highly adaptable. The rules and reasons the political system employs to enforce status relations of any kind, including racial hierarchy, evolve and change as they are challenged. That's kind of how sociology works, right? It's adaptable. It evolves. That's another thing, just as a little side tangent, but not really. This is the idea that sociology is like some sort of pseudoscience, but it's a legitimate science. And, if we take sociology seriously and study it as a serious science, we will come to this truth that, social systems adapt and evolve. And a lot of the same kinds of systems reoccur. It's happening here. The other thing I want to bring up is the reason why I call myself the Black Ponder is because I don't want to be used as some sort of example of black exceptionalism. People look at my channel, they're like, look, this guy, he's reading philosophy, he's reading complicated books, and he's not talking about race at all. So this is just a perfect example of why race doesn't exist, because this guy's doing it, and this is a black man that doesn't, isn't bound by his race at all. Wrong. Race has played a huge impact on my life. And I'm here to tell you, just because I read Hegel doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge that racism is still a thing in the 21st century, because it definitely is. But let's talk more about truth and our misconception of things, particularly the criminal justice system and how it is often mistaken. How society as a whole really doesn't understand how the criminal justice system actually works in reality. This is page 75. I begin on the first paragraph. We may think we know how the criminal justice system works. Television is overloaded with fictional dramas about police, crime, and prosecutors. I skip down four lines. A charismatic police officer, investigator, or prosecutor struggles with his own demons while heroically trying to solve a horrible crime. He ultimately achieves a personal and moral victory by finding the bad guy and throwing him in jail. You know, Law and Order, CSI, right? All those like criminal shows that are like a staple of mainstream television, which has been around for ages. I skip down 3 lines. These television shows, especially those that romanticize drug law enforcement, are the modern day equivalent of the old movies portraying happy slaves, the fictional gloss placed on a brutal system of racialized oppression and control. Yeah, like, you know, like that old Disney movie, The Song of the South. You know, that's what Law and Order is, essentially. If we really want to get to the truth of the matter, that's what's happening. Those who have been swept within the criminal justice system know that the way the system actually works bears little resemblance to what happens on television or in movies. Full-blown trials of guilt or innocence rarely occur. Many people never even meet with an attorney. Witnesses are routinely paid and coerced by the government. Police regularly stop and search people for no reason whatsoever. Happened to me many times, just saying. Penalties for many crimes are so severe that innocent people plead guilty, accepting plea bargains to avoid harsh mandatory sentences, and children, even as young as 14, are sent to adult prisons. Rules of law and procedure such as guilt beyond reasonable doubt or probable cause or reasonable suspicion can easily be found in court cases and law school textbooks, but are much harder to find in real life. So the way criminal justice is portrayed in popular media, like television shows, movies, that's actually not how criminal justice is done in reality. Let's talk more about how criminal justice is actually carried forth. Okay, this is page 122. This is the second paragraph, 3rd line. In every state across our nation, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subjected to tactics and practices that would result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. In the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. The law enforcement methods have been employed almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in jaw-dropping numbers of African Americans and Latinos filling our nation's prisons and jails every year. We are told by drug warriors that the enemy in this war is a thing, drugs, not a group of people, but the facts prove otherwise. And we know this. We really do. And if you don't, just do some research, some basic research. It's not hard to find. I would encourage you, to get this book, check it out at the library if you don't have the money, and check out the works cited. Lots of quotes, lots of citations, lots of good research. Now we're on page 123, second paragraph. There is, of course, an official explanation for all of this, crime rates. This explanation has tremendous appeal before you know the facts, for it is consistent with and reinforces dominant racial narratives about crime and criminality dating back to slavery. The truth, however, is that rates and patterns of drug crime do not explain the glaring racial disparities in our criminal justice system. People of all races use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. And there are citations for you to find those things. And if you would, just comment below. Okay, can you give me some citations about what you talked about? I'll be happy to put some citations down for you in the comment section so you can look up this information on your own in case you don't know. But, we really don't know, really, truthfully? Apparently a lot of people don't. If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than people of color. I just gotta say that again, because this idea that oh, they just, black people just commit more crimes than white people. That's why there's more of them in jail. It's like, come on, really? It's bogus when you say it. Maybe you don't know, and I'm not judging, but the research is out there. I am judging that. Look, don't be lazy. Look it up. Where to start? This book. But let me continue. This is page 125. This is the second paragraph. What then does explain the extraordinary racial disparities in our criminal justice system? Question mark. Old-fashioned racism seems out of the question. Okay, we skip 4 lines. Forms of race discrimination that were open and notorious for centuries were transformed in the 1960s and 1970s into something un-American, an affront to our newly conceived ethic of colorblindness. Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about like blunt, like overtly hateful racism, like the use of the N-word directly in somebody's face, or like, the hanging of nooses and things like that, very overtly explicit racist things are rare, right? Although you do see them to this day from time to time, don't you, right? So that's the thing that you're still seeing. But that, generally speaking, in our society is, in modern day America, is not accepted, right? It's like, that's considered unethical. So old-fashioned racism is not what's happening. But racism is happening. So what kind of racism? Let me continue. This is the last paragraph. This dramatically changed racial climate has led defenders of mass incarceration to insist that our criminal justice system, whatever its past sins, is now largely fair and not discriminatory. Because we don't see this old-fashioned racism on the level that we've seen in the 50s and before. They point to violent crime rates in the African American community as justification for the staggering number of black men who find themselves behind bars. Black men, they say, have much higher rates of violent crime. That's why so many of them are locked up. Typically, this is where the discussion ends. I have experienced that in comment sections of Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and such. That's just violent people. That's just how it is. And it might not be, a racial thing. A lot of people told me, well, they've just grown up in poverty, and poverty creates violence. So, sorry, that's just the thing that happens. What we need to do is solve poverty. But as Michelle Alexander is saying, no, it's not. That's not the key issue here. That's the reason why there's so many black and brown people behind bars. But let me continue. I'm just continuing right where I left off. The problem with this abbreviated analysis is that violent crime is not responsible for mass incarceration. As numerous researchers have shown, violent crime rates have fluctuated over the years and bear little relationship to incarceration rates, which have soared during the past 3 decades, regardless of whether violent crime was going up or down. Today, violent crime rates are at historically low levels, yet incarceration rates continue to climb. So what gives? I'll continue. This is page 128. This is the second paragraph, 6th line. The lie that, quote, most people sent to prison are violent offenders, unquote, is dangerous because it perpetuates the false notion that our system of mass incarceration is primarily concerned with violence and that it is well designed to keep people safe. In fact, the system is primarily concerned with the perpetual control and marginalization of the dispossessed. I believe I read this before when we were reading the preface, but it's worth repeating because people don't get it. I'll skip down. This is the last paragraph. This is the third to the last line of this page. We ought not be misled by those who insist that violent crime has driven the rise of this unprecedented system of racial and social control. The uncomfortable reality is that a literal war has been waged on our most vulnerable communities, and convictions for relatively minor non-violent offenses have propelled mass incarceration. This is the reality. This is the truth. I skip down. This is the page 129, the last paragraph. A bit of common sense is overdue in public discussions about racial bias in the criminal justice system. The great debate over whether black men have been targeted by the criminal justice system or unfairly treated in the war on drugs often overlooks the obvious. What is painfully obvious when one steps back from the individual cases and specific policies is that the system of mass incarceration operates with stunning efficiency to sweep people of color off the streets, lock them in cages, and then release them into an inferior second-class status. Nowhere is this more true than in the war on drugs. Okay? The war on drugs started largely implemented in that 1980s under the guise of, okay, we're going to get rid of all these drug users, and drugs is the problem, and we're going to get rid of like all this drug crime. But when that happened, during that whole campaign, a huge number of prisons were built, and a huge amount of black and brown people were thrown into those prisons that were built. So you have to like consider, okay, this is actually happening. Like, I'm seeing the effects. The facts are telling me something, right? Look at the facts as they present themselves, and use some common sense. Let's continue with color blindness and why that's not really a thing, okay? And understand there's a reason why black and brown people are primarily the incarcerated population in America, and how there really isn't a correlation between that and violent crime. Okay, what's going on here? So we're going to read page 133. This is the last paragraph. Decades of cognitive bias research demonstrate that both unconscious and conscious biases lead to discriminatory actions, even when an individual does not want to discriminate. The quotation commonly attributed to Nietzsche, that's philosophy, that there is no immaculate perception, perfectly captures how cognitive schemas, thought structures, influence what we notice and how things we notice get interpreted. Studies have shown that racial schemas operate not only as parts of conscious, rational deliberations, but also automatically without conscious awareness or intent. And the studies have been quoted. Works cited. I'll be happy to share that with you in the comments if you want. There's also been a ton of new research ever since the publishing of this book, which I'm happy to share with you. Scientific research, mind you. But let me continue. We got to skip down 8 lines, okay? The pattern of discrimination reflected automatic, unconscious thought processes, not careful deliberations. Most striking, perhaps, is the overwhelming evidence that implicit bias measures are disassociated from explicit bias measures. In other words, the fact that you may honestly believe that you are not biased against African Americans and that you may even have black friends or relatives does not mean that you are free from unconscious bias. Implicit bias tests may still show that you hold negative attitudes and stereotypes about blacks, even though you do not believe you do and do not want to. Okay? So whether I call myself the Black Ponder or the Ponder, you're still going to look at me and say, oh, that's a black dude talking about philosophy. It's just going to happen. You know what I'm saying? Why? Because we've been programmed since birth because of this country that we live in, and quite frankly, the world that we live in, where a lot of this racial programming is instilled in us. And we have to confront this issue, right? We can't just ignore it like, oh, I don't see race. Yeah, you do. You do see race. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why you do and be aware of it. Let me skip down 6 lines. Many people who think they are not biased prove when tested to have relatively high levels of bias. The less biased you think you are, the more biased you are. Okay? And this is scientific research. Again, I would encourage you, read the book, but if you don't want to go that far, I'll be happy to share with you in the comments if you want to comment and ask me about that. I'll list these citations there for you, and I'll even list new ones, because this book is over 10 years old now. This is page 135, the second paragraph. Viewed as a whole, the relevant research by cognitive and social psychologists to date suggests that racial bias in the drug war was inevitable. Once a public consensus was constructed by political and media elites that drug crime is black and brown. Once blackness and crime, especially drug crime, became conflated in the public consciousness, the criminal black man, quote unquote, would inevitably become the primary target of law enforcement. Some discrimination would be conscious and deliberate, as many honestly and consciously would believe that black men deserve extra scrutiny and harsher treatment. Let's not get it twisted. There's a lot of straightforward, hateful racism out there. We do see that. But for the most part, let me continue to quote, much racial bias, though, would operate unconsciously and automatically, even among law enforcement officials generally committed to equal treatment under the law. So let's talk more about the consequences of this unconscious bias and how it plays into the criminal justice system. Who is really the targets of the criminal justice system? Is it violent offenders or is it someone else? This is page 155, third paragraph. From the outset, the drug war could have been waged primarily in overwhelmingly white suburbs or on college campuses. SWAT teams could have rappelled from helicopters in gated suburban communities and raided the homes of high school lacrosse players known for hosting coke and ecstasy parties after their games. The police could have seized televisions, furniture, and cash from fraternity houses based on an anonymous tip that a few joints or a stash of cocaine could be found hidden in someone's dresser drawer. Suburban homemakers could have been placed under surveillance and subjected to undercover operations designed to catch them violating laws, regulating the use and sale of prescription uppers. All of this could have happened as a matter of routine in white communities, but it did not. Think about why it didn't. As we have discussed before, white people are just as likely to commit drug offenses as much as any other person of color, but why they were not the targets? That's a question. I'll continue. Instead, when police go looking for drugs, they look in the hood, tactics that would be political suicide in an upscale white suburb are not even newsworthy in poor black and brown communities. As long as mass drug arrests are concentrated in impoverished urban areas, police chiefs have little reason to fear a political backlash, no matter how aggressive and warlike the efforts may be. And so long as the number of drug arrests increases or at least remains high, federal dollars continue to flow in and fill the department's coffers. As one former prosecutor put it, it's a lot easier to go out to the hood, so to speak, and pick somebody than to put your resources in an undercover operation in a community where there are potentially political powerful people. The hyper-segregation of the black poor in ghetto communities has made the roundup easy. Confined to ghetto areas and lacking political power, the black poor are convenient targets. People choose to ignore that fact, that reality that actually happens. But I call myself the Black Ponder to force you to think about these kinds of issues, because that is in large part what is holding humanity backward. But now let's consider, okay, how does this caste system work? How does the criminal justice system operate as a racial caste system? How does that happen? Well, I'll read you page 174. This is the sixth to the last line. This system depends primarily on the prison label, not prison time. What matters most is who gets swept into this system of control and then ushered into an underclass. The legal rules adopted by the Supreme Court guarantee that those who find themselves locked up and permanently locked out due to the drug war are overwhelmingly black and brown. Now I read you page 176. This is the second paragraph. Today, a criminal freed from prison has scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a freed slave or a black person living free, quote unquote, in Mississippi at the height of Jim Crow. Those released From prison, on parole can be stopped and searched by the police for any reason or no reason at all, and returned to prison for the most minor of infractions, such as failing to attend a meeting with a parole officer. Even when released from the system's formal control, the stigma of criminality lingers. Police supervision, monitoring, and harassment are facts of life not only for all those labeled criminals, but for all those who look like criminals. Okay, lynch mobs may be long gone, but the threat of police violence is ever present. We're seeing that with the publicization of the police killings of unarmed black men and women, right? Now that everybody has a camera in their pockets. A wrong move or sudden gesture could mean massive retaliation by the police. A wallet could be mistaken for a gun. The whites only signs may be gone, but new signs have gone up. Notices placed in job applications, rental agreements, loan applications, forms for welfare benefits, school applications, and petitions for licenses, informing the general public that felons are not wanted here. A criminal record today authorizes precisely the forms of discrimination we supposedly left behind. Discrimination in employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service. Those labeled criminals can be denied the right to vote. Criminals, it turns out, are the one social group in America we have permission to hate. In colorblind America, criminals are the new whipping boys. They are entitled to no respect and little moral concern. Like the coloreds, the years following emancipation, criminals today are deemed a characterless and purposeless people, deserving of our collective scorn and contempt. When we say someone was treated like a criminal, what we mean to say is that he or she was treated as less than human, like a shameful creature. Hundreds of years ago, our nations put those considered less than human in shackles. Less than 100 years ago, we relegated them to the other side of town. Today, we put them in cages. Once released, they find that a heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon them. There's still forms of discrimination to this day, but we discriminate against criminals, and it's legal. Think about such a thing on a philosophical level. Think about the ethics and morals of that. So now we're on page 219. And I'm going to start on this last paragraph because I know what you're thinking. Okay? What are you thinking? I'll read. None of this is to suggest that those who break the law bear no responsibility for their conduct or exist merely as products of their environment. To deny the individual agency of those caught up in the system, their capacity to overthrow seemingly impossible odds, will be to deny an essential element of their humanity. We as human beings are not simply organisms or animals responding to stimuli. We have a higher self, a capacity for transcendence. Ooh, that's philosophical. Yet, our ability to exercise free will and transcend the most extraordinary obstacles does not make the conditions of our life irrelevant. Okay, conditions do matter. We can transcend them, but they still play a huge and truthful part in our life. We're on page 220, and this is the last paragraph. As a society, our decision to heap shame and contempt upon those who struggle and fail in a system designed to keep them locked up and locked out says far more about ourselves than it does about them. It says a lot more about society as a whole than it does about the people we lock up. There is another path. Rather than shaming and condemning an already deeply stigmatized group, we collectively can embrace them. Not necessarily their behavior, but them, their humanness. As the saying goes, you gotta hate the crime, but love the criminal. This is not a mere platitude. It is a prescription for liberation. If we had actually learned to show love, care, compassion, and concern across racial lines during the Civil Rights Movement, rather than go colorblind, mass incarceration would not exist today. Meaning, if we acknowledge race as an actual thing, if you saw the name the Black Ponder and wasn't tripping, like, oh shit, Black Ponder, why you gotta bring that title? What's up with that? If we lived in a society where you could just do that and people would be like, oh, okay, Black Ponder, yep, race is his thing, and I'm glad this guy's doing what he's doing despite the conditions that he's in. If we lived in that kind of society, the horror of mass incarceration would not be here today. We have to see the problem as it actually is, the truth of the problem. Okay? Here we are on page 228. This is the fifth to the last line of the first paragraph. Our understanding of racism is therefore shaped by the most extreme expressions of individual bigotry, not by the way in which it functions naturally, almost invisibly, and sometimes with genuinely benign intent, when it is embedded in the structure of a social system. The unfortunate reality we must face is that racism manifests itself not only in individual attitudes and stereotypes, but also in the basic structure of society. Okay? Systemic racism. That's a thing. In fact, that is how racism primarily works. Not individuals doing hateful racial deeds, but systems that are designed to exclude people based off of race, where particular individuals' lack of involvement allows the system to continue to progress. Okay, that's primarily how racism works. But now we're on page 229. This is the second line. In the system of mass incarceration, a wide variety of laws, institutions, and practices ranging from racial profiling to biased sentencing policies, political disenfranchisement, and legalized employment discrimination trap African Americans in a virtual and literal cage. I skipped down 10 lines. It is far more convenient to imagine that a majority of young African American men in urban areas freely choose a life of crime than to accept the real possibility that their lives were structured in a way that virtually guaranteed their early admission into a system from which they can never escape. Most people are willing to acknowledge the existence of the cage, but insist that a door has been left open. Let me skip down 2 lines. It is a set of structural arrangements that locks a racially distinct group into a subordinate political, social, and economic position, effectively creating a second-class citizenship. Those trapped within the system are not merely disadvantaged in the sense that they are competing on an unequal playing field or face additional hurdles to political or economic success. Rather, the system itself is structured to lock them into a subordinate position. We're going to the next page, to 230. This is the 5th line. Only when we view the cage from a distance can we disengage from the maze of rationalizations that are offered for each wire and see how the entire apparatus operates to keep African Americans perpetually trapped. Okay? So we gotta look at it systematically or systemically. Either or both, right? So let's talk about the systemic nature of race. This is page 246. I begin on the last line. The conflation of blackness, okay, now we're talking about the term blackness, Black Ponder, blackness. Well, let's analyze this word. The conflation of blackness with crime did not happen organically. Rather, it was constructed by political and media elites as part of the broad project known as the War on Drugs. This conflation served to provide a legitimate outlet to the expression of anti-black resentment and animus, and a convenient release valve now that explicit forms of racial bias are strictly condemned. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer permissible to hate blacks, but we can hate criminals, equating blackness to criminality to continue the racial discrimination that we've seen throughout American history. Similar system, just different form. Now we're on page 247. This is the second paragraph. It is precisely because our criminal justice system provides a vehicle for the expression of conscious and unconscious anti-black sentiment that the prison label is experienced as a racial stigma. The stigma exists whether or not one has been formally branded a criminal. Skip down 9 lines here. The stigma of race has become the stigma of criminality. Throughout the criminal justice system, as well as our schools and public spaces, young plus black plus male is equated with reasonable suspicion, justifying the arrest, interrogation, search, and detention of thousands of African Americans every year, as well as their exclusion from employment and housing and the denial of educational opportunity. Now we're on page 248. This is the fifth to the last line. This process of being made a criminal is to a large extent the process of becoming black. To be a man of color of a certain economic class in milieu is equivalent in the public eye to being a criminal. Being processed by the criminal justice system is tantamount to being made black. And doing time behind bars is at the same time marking race as its core. Then mass incarceration, like Jim Crow, is a race-making institution. It serves to define the meaning and significance of race in America. Pop culture assigns these traits to blackness, like doing time, being behind bars, doing criminal activity. We see from popular music to television shows that are very popular to movies. What does it mean to be black? Look at how black people are portrayed in pop culture. And yes, there are exceptions, but if you just look at overall television, overall pop culture, you'll see that the construction of race is a social construction done by media elites. So let's read page 242. This is the fourth line down on the second paragraph. This is important. The claim is not meant to suggest or imply that supporters of the current system are racist in the way Americans have come to understand the term. Okay, we're talking about race, hateful racists, like you hate me because I'm the color of my skin. That's not to say that people who support the system hate me because of the color of my skin. Okay, understand. Race plays a major role, indeed a defining role in the current system, but not because of what is commonly understood as old-fashioned hostile bigotry. This system of control depends far more on racial indifference. Racial indifference, that's what this system of control depends on. What is racial indifference? It's, don't call yourself the Black Ponderer, call yourself the Ponderer. I don't see race. Philosophy is stained by your race identification. That's racial indifference, and you're perpetuating, promoting, sustaining racial inequality. But let me continue to quote. Racial indifference defined as a lack of compassion and caring about race and people belonging to certain racial groups. Then racial hostility, a feature it actually shares with its predecessors. All racial caste systems, not just mass incarceration, have been supported by racial indifference. Let me skip down 4 lines. Martin Luther King Jr. to declare, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." The notion that all racial caste systems are necessarily predicated on a desire to harm other racial groups and that racial hostility is the essence of racism is fundamentally misguided. That is not how racism works. Like hateful bigotry is a part of racism, but that is not all of what racism is. We're on page 253. This is the 12th line down. Preoccupation with the role of racial hostility in earlier caste systems can blind us to the ways in which every caste system, including mass incarceration, has been supported by racial indifference. A lack of care and compassion for people of other races. Racial animus is a predictable and recurring feature of racial caste systems, but it is not necessary for the system to function if there is widespread racial indifference. We're on page 254 at the top. It seems obvious that mass incarceration directly harms far more whites than Jim Crow ever did. Okay, we're talking about how it not only hurts people of color, primarily black people, but it also hurts white people. Let me skip down 1 line. An interracial caste system may seem like an oxymoron. What kind of racial caste system includes white people within its control? The answer, a racial caste system in the age of color blindness. That, because we do see poor white people affected by mass incarceration, which is a racial caste system. Why? Because of color blindness, this refusal to ignore race. Let me explain by continuing to read. If 100% of the people arrested and convicted for drug offenses were African American, the situation would provoke outrage among the majority of Americans. Skip down the line. We as a nation seem comfortable with 90% of the people arrested and convicted of drug offenses, in some states being African American, but if the figure were 100%, the veil of colorblindness would be lost. We skip down 4 lines. The inclusion of some whites in the system of control is essential to preserving the image of a colorblind criminal justice system and maintaining our self-image as fair and unbiased people. Because most Americans, including those within law enforcement, want to believe they are non-racist. The suffering in the drug war crosses the color line. And this is how, colorblindness hurts everybody, right? This lack of this refusal to acknowledge race as an issue, everybody's getting hurt by it. This is page 267, the last paragraph. The genius of the current caste system and what most distinguishes it from its predecessors is that it appears voluntary. People choose to commit crimes, and that's why they are locked up and locked out, we are told. The feature makes the politics of responsibility particularly tempting, as it appears the system can be avoided with good behavior. But herein lies the trap. All people make mistakes. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals. All of us violate the law at some point in our lives. That's kind of the tenet of Christianity, right? Original sin. However, the average Christian, if you were to ask them, would refuse to accept that. They'd be like, well, no, there's a difference between me and that person over there. I deem a criminal. But I don't think Jesus would say that. But let me continue. Let me stay on topic. Here's the second paragraph of page 268. The notion that a vast gulf exists between criminals and those of us who have never served time in prison is a fiction created by the racial ideology that birthed mass incarceration. Namely, that there is something fundamentally wrong and morally inferior about them, the criminal. The reality, though, is that all of us have done wrong. As noted earlier, studies suggest that most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Indeed, most of us break the law not once, but repeatedly throughout our lives. Yet only some of us will be arrested, charged, convicted of a crime, branded a criminal or felon, and ushered into a permanent undercaste. Who becomes a social pariah and excommunicated from civil society? And who trots off to college, bears scant relationship to the morality of crimes committed? Skip down 7 lines. Our racially based system of mass incarceration exploits the fact that all people break the law and make mistakes at various points in their lives and with varying degrees of justification. Screwing up, failing to live by one's highest ideals and values is part of what makes us human. Let me read you this, page 272. This is the 3rd paragraph. It is fair to say that we have witnessed an evolution in the United States from a racial caste system based entirely on exploitation, slavery, to one based largely on subordination, Jim Crow, to one defined by marginalization, mass incarceration. Okay? The racial caste system has taken on different forms. Mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the new slavery. We're on top of page 273. The sense among those left behind that society no longer has use for them and that the government now aims simply to get rid of them reflects a reality that many of us who claim to care prefer to avoid simply by changing the channel. Changing the YouTube channel, right? Don't call yourself the Black Ponderer. Call yourself the Ponderer. Nope, not going to do it. I'm not going to simply choose to avoid this issue because it's very important and it's actually happening. Page 277. Last paragraph, second line. Few Americans today recognize mass incarceration for what it is, a new caste system thinly veiled by the cloak of color blindness. Hundreds of thousands of people of color are swept into the system and released every year, yet we rationalize the systematic discrimination and exclusion and turn a blind eye to the suffering. Our collective denial is not merely an inconvenient fact, it is a major stumbling block, a public understanding of the role of race in our society, and it sharply limits the opportunities for truly transformative collective action. That's what I'm talking about. It's time to act. It's time to transform the flawed system. So we gotta talk about it. Page 290, second paragraph, fourth line. The notion that all of these reforms can be accomplished piecemeal, one at a time, through disconnected advocacy strategies, seems deeply misguided. All of the needed reforms have less to do with failed policies than a deeply flawed public consensus, one that is indifferent, at best, to the experience of poor people of color. I skipped down 4 lines. We have to make the case in the court of public opinion. That's what we got to do. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said this. Okay? That's what I'm trying to do. Let's make the case that we need to do something about it. Now, I'm making the case that we need to acknowledge racism for what it is and not ignore it and not pretend like it's not a thing, because it is. I skipped down another 4 lines. Dr. King believed what was necessary was to mobilize thousands to make their case in the court of public opinion. In his view, it was a flawed public consensus, not merely flawed policy, that was at the root of racial oppression. Today, no less than 50 years ago, now 60, a flawed public consensus lies at the core of the prevailing caste system. We're on page 291. I start at the 8th line. It is this failure to care, really care, across color lines that lies at the core of this system of control in every racial caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. Those who believe that advocacy challenging mass incarceration can be successful without overturning the public consensus that gave rise to it are engaging in fanciful thinking, a form of denial. Isolated victories can be won, even a string of victories, but in the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, the system as a whole will remain intact. To the extent that the major changes are achieved without a complete shift, the system will rebound. The caste system will re-emerge in a new form, just as convict leasing replaced slavery, or it will be reborn, just as mass incarceration replaced Jim Crow. Let it be known. Okay, gotta confront the issue or it's just gonna come back and bite us in the ass again. Page 302, last paragraph. The uncomfortable truth, however, is that racial differences will always exist among us. Okay? There's not going to be a color blindness. It's just not going to happen. Why? Even if the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration were completely overcome, we would remain a nation of immigrants and indigenous people in a larger world divided by race and ethnicity. It is a world in which there is extraordinary racial and ethnic inequality, and our nation has porous boundaries. For the foreseeable future, racial and ethnic inequality will be a feature of American life. This reality is not cause for despair. The idea that we may never reach a state of perfect racial equality, a perfect racial equilibrium, is not cause for alarm. What is concerning is the real possibility that we, as a society, will choose not to care. We will choose to be blind to injustice and the suffering of others. We will look the other way and deny our public agencies the resources, data, and tools they need to solve problems. We will refuse to celebrate what is beautiful about our distinct cultures and histories, even as we blend and evolve. That is cause for despair. Seeing race is not the problem. Refusing to care for the people we see is the problem. The fact that the meaning of race may evolve over time or lose much of its significance is hardly a reason to be struck blind. We should hope not for a colorblind society, but instead for a world in which we can see each other fully, learn from each other, and do what we can to respond to each other with love. That was King's dream. A society that is capable of seeing each of us as we are, with love. That is a goal worth fighting for. So, as a result, I continue to call this channel The Black Ponder, because I will not be indifferent on this issue. Page 308, second paragraph, third line. The truth, however, is this. Far from undermining the current system of control, the new caste system depends in no small part on black exceptionalism. The colorblind public consensus that supports the new caste system insists that race no longer matters. Now that America has officially embraced Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream by reducing it to a platitude that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. That's not all of what Dr. King said, but most people only remember him for that. The mass incarceration of people of color can be justified only to the extent that the plight of those locked up and locked out is understood to be their choice, not their birthright. In short, mass incarceration is predicated on the notion that an extraordinary number of African Americans, but not all, have freely chosen a life of crime and thus belong behind bars and should be stripped of basic rights of citizenship. A belief that all blacks belong in jail would be incompatible with the social consensus that we have moved beyond race, and that race is no longer relevant. But a widespread belief that a majority of black and brown men unfortunately belong in jail is compatible with the new American creed, provided that their imprisonment can be interpreted as their own fault. If the prison label imposed on them can be blamed on their culture, poor work ethic, or even their families, then society is absolved of the responsibility to do anything about their condition. This is where black exceptionalism comes in. Highly visible examples of black success are critical to be the maintenance of a racial caste system in the era of color blindness. Black success stories lend credence to the notion that anyone, no matter how poor or how black you may be, can make it to the top, if only you try hard enough. These stories prove that race no longer is relevant. But I got something to tell you. Race is relevant. And I refuse to be an example used to disregard race. All right? I will not be like a version of black exceptionalism. Hey, look at that guy. You know, you should be like him. He is talking about continental philosophy, and he's not talking about race at all. See? We don't even have to worry about race. You know, as long as you talk about Rene Descartes and his concept of radical doubt, or, you know, Nietzsche's will to power, or Marx's theory of capital, then race doesn't play an issue at all, right? Be more like that guy. No, I will not be that guy. I will not be that guy. Racism is a huge part of why humanity cannot move forward. Is a huge reason why we as a species cannot progress further. And it's still just as relevant today as it was during the times of American slavery. Not only should we not ignore this issue, we got to start thinking about this issue on contemporary terms and not think of this issue as something that's just out of date, irrelevant, old news. Okay, we got to apply critical analysis, problem solving, and we basically just got to talk about it. Okay, and you know, let's bring philosophy into this discussion. Okay, as I've always said, philosophy, I feel, is a dramatically underutilized tool that we can use to solve a lot of humanity's major problems. And one of humanity's most pressing problems is social injustice, which includes racism. So that's why I call this channel The Black Ponder, and that's why I will never take the black out of that title. Now, if you don't want to subscribe or like my videos or, you know, dislike my videos because of that, that's your prerogative. The only thing I can do is provide you with the information, factual information, and philosophical analysis, and try to, you know, join in with authors like Michelle Alexander, who are part of the discourse, the dialogue, the discussion, to get public consensus, to get people to understand that, you know, this thing of race, this is a real problem. And we got to talk about it, and we can't be ignoring it, and we have not defeated it yet. It is not gone. So we got to keep the series going. Why this channel is called The Black Ponderer. We got to keep it rolling. We got many more books within this series that we're going to cover. Join me as I try to bring this issue into the public consensus, the public consciousness. And please, check out this modern masterpiece of a book, The New Jim Crow. Buy it at your bookstore, check it out at your public library. Do yourself a favor and read it, because it brings to light true issues that the United States is dealing with and issues that we need to focus on solving. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.